So picture this. The United States literally executes its own central bank, gets dragged into a devastating war just 3 months later, and then has to watch its own capital city burn to the ground. You've got a bankrupt treasury, a mountain of completely worthless paper currency, and the entire American capitalist experiment is just days away from absolute extinction. But what happened next didn't destroy Wall Street. It actually birthed the modern financial machine.
Right, so back in 1811, Wall Street was playing with absolute fire. The first bank of the United States had successfully anchored the economy for 20 years, but politicians down in Washington decided to kill its charter. And they did it by just a single tie-breaking vote from the vice president. The central bank officially closes its doors, leaving this massive institutional void right before an unprecedented geopolitical crisis. Suddenly, hundreds of tiny, completely unregulated state banks rush in to fill the vacuum, printing their own unique paper currencies with virtually zero oversight.
And the immediate consequence of that? This wild network of state banks floods the country with paper money to fund the military. They exploded the aggregate banknotes and deposits in circulation by an astronomical 87.2%. It was the 19th century equivalent of just ripping the knob off the money printer. They're issuing ungodly amounts of paper money backed by absolutely nothing but empty promises and greed, and it fundamentally altered the entire structure of the American banking system.
Now, fast forward to the brutal retail impact here, because this exact debt bubble ultimately forced 343 banks to go completely belly up. Imagine holding paper bills that actually changed in value depending on how far you walked from the bank vault, only to have that institution collapse entirely. The lifetime savings of everyday citizens were vaporized overnight, mostly because there was zero government insurance to protect their deposits back then. This is exactly how unchecked debt cycles ruthlessly punish the retail investor.
Then, the absolute nightmare scenario materializes in August 1814. British troops march right into Washington, D.C. and set the Capitol ablaze. Panic just rips through the banking system, triggering massive, widespread bank runs. Lacking the actual gold and silver to meet these sudden redemption demands, banks from Baltimore all the way up to New York are forced to freeze all gold and silver payouts. The stabilizing anchor of American wealth was gone. The nation was effectively thrown onto a depreciated, completely inconvertible paper standard.
So the U.S. Treasury is now pushed to the absolute brink of default, desperately trying to survive on a failed public loan that barely raised a third of what it actually needed. Out of options, Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin turns to 3 ultra-wealthy, foreign-born merchants, Stephen Girard, John Jacob Astor, and David Parrish. This shadow syndicate steps in and forms the first real underwriting group in American history to secretly bail out the government, dictating their own extremely lucrative terms.
But you've got to look at the opportunistic greed of this syndicate. They bought up the nation's survival loans at an exclusive 12% discount to par, meaning they were paying just $88 for every $100 of face value. It was the ultimate distressed asset play. Stephen Girard personally covered the vast majority of the commitment, and sure, they saved the government from immediate bankruptcy, but they also supercharged a highly dangerous, wildly leveraged debt bubble in the process.
So now we've got this incredible contradiction: a booming economy running on completely depreciated paper currency. To really analyze this, contemporary economists calculated the private market price of specie, the hard gold and silver that was supposed to back the system. And the math proves the reality here. You couldn't use a New York dollar bill to buy goods in Boston without losing a huge chunk of your wealth to overnight inflation. By 1815, average annual banknote depreciation in New York hit over 10%. The adjusted private market price of hard money was skyrocketing compared to this depreciating paper.
By 1816, the sheer chaos forces Washington to pivot. They charter the second bank of the United States with a staggering $35 million in capital just to clean up the mess. Sounds like a solid plan, right? Except its very first president was a politically connected bankrupt named William Jones. Instead of reining in the speculative lending, the new central bank engages in a completely reckless credit expansion, adding over $19.2 million to the domestic money supply in just its first year and a half.
This new tidal wave of cheap credit fuels an absolutely unprecedented land and agricultural commodity boom. The valuation of this paper prosperity drove wild, rampant speculation. Settlers and speculators out in the South and West borrowed heavily to buy up public land, completely convinced that high crop prices, fueled mostly by European demand, were going to make them rich overnight. Public land debt outstanding absolutely ballooned from $3 million to $17 million.
The entire nation feels like an unstoppable money machine, yet there's a hidden, fatal flaw lurking right inside the central bank's own branches. Injecting massive structural rot into the system, we see outright fraud at the Baltimore branch. A rogue cashier named James McCullough, who's earning a modest salary of maybe $4,000 a year, somehow manages to secretly borrow over $500,000 to fund his own personal stock speculation. Insiders were quietly writing uncollateralized loans to themselves using dummy names. It was quite literally insider trading on a systemic, institutional level.
Then comes the global rug pull in late 1818. As European farming finally recovers from the Napoleonic Wars, foreign demand for American crops just evaporates. At the exact same time, European central banks start aggressively hoarding gold and silver to return to a species standard, yanking hard currency right out of the global market. With that liquidity gone, the heavily leveraged American system begins to immediately fracture.
The resulting commodity crash was incredibly violent. Short staple cotton, which was the primary export engine of the United States, plummeted from a high of 33 cents per pound in 1818 down to under 15 cents a pound in just months. That is a 50% haircut almost instantly. Crop prices for wheat and tobacco fell by as much as 75%. This agricultural export engine essentially dragged the entire American economy down with it.
Facing a severe drain on its own gold reserves, the Second Bank of the United States straight up panics and slams on the credit brakes. The new bank president, Langdon Cheves, aggressively cuts the volume of banknotes in circulation in half. He ruthlessly forecloses on outstanding mortgages and systematically forces state banks into bankruptcy if they couldn't pay in gold or silver on demand. All of this just to save the central bank's own balance sheet, completely leaving the retail economy to suffocate.
So the young republic is just slammed by its first true Great Depression. The real estate market evaporates, leading to widespread frontier foreclosures that left entire communities completely displaced. Everyday merchants are left holding fat stacks of worthless paper currency, and inside the newly formed New York Stock and Exchange Board, the panic was so severe that brokers rushed to liquidate assets, forcing the board to suspend trading for the very first time in history.
The real-world portfolio impact here is just devastating. In manufacturing hubs like Philadelphia, industrial employment collapsed by a staggering 78%. The weekly wage bill in those industries dropped from $58,000 down to barely $12,000. Over 50,000 newly unemployed workers across major cities were forced into desperate almshouses and workhouses. Guys, this is exactly what a hard landing actually looks like.
This entire decade is defined by this massive, high-stakes tug-of-war between centralized financial control and deep public distrust. Financiers argued the U.S. absolutely needed a national bank for uniform currency, but an angry public viewed central banking as an unconstitutional monopoly that only favored wealthy northern creditors. Sound familiar? It's the exact same foundational argument people have about the Federal Reserve today, and this historical distrust turned into absolute outrage when the second bank actively triggered a nationwide crash just to save itself.
This ideological warfare goes all the way up to the Supreme Court and the landmark case McCullough v. Maryland. The state of Maryland literally tried to tax the national bank out of existence. But Chief Justice John Marshall upholds federal financial supremacy, famously declaring, "The power to tax involves the power to destroy." So the federal government cements its financial control at the exact moment the public is losing their life savings.
Projecting this fallout into the 1820s, what we see is a grueling recovery characterized by a long, painful deflationary grind. With general prices down over 30%, businesses operated with extreme caution. Communities had to rely on desperate state debtor relief measures like stay laws and minimum appraisal laws. These were enacted simply to prevent widespread property seizures and keep bankrupt citizens out of debtor prisons.
The second forward-looking scenario shows a massive, historic rotation in investment capital. With public trust in toxic paper assets and volatile commodity speculation sitting at practically zero, capital pivots heavily toward tangible state infrastructure. The economic devastation actually incentivized states to fund canal networks, roads, and transport systems. They were laying down the physical groundwork for a much more integrated, resilient domestic market.
When a young nation tries to build a booming empire while simultaneously dismantling its own monetary foundation, it doesn't just create a free market. It engineers its own destruction. So it leaves us with this unresolved scar on the American psyche. If an economy is built entirely on fiat paper and debt, engineered by distant elites, who really pays the price when the bill comes due? And does this prove that such a financial system is inherently doomed to fail? Let me know your market outlooks in the comments.
An investment in knowledge pays the best interest, so why not invest in this channel? Click like and subscribe for more.